And so here we come out of World War II, and we get into this period of redefining the West. And I'm going to kind of do a combination of some lectures using this text and then inserting also some of my lectures from my World Civ class where I also cover the same topic. Much of what I'm going to go over is still going to correlate with the text, some not as much. But ultimately, I think this is the part that's significant because the whole obsession with anti-communism really is going to come out of this. So as I was mentioning, Stalin is our comrade at one point, but immediately, and it was understood by everyone in power, where the direction of this war was going to go. I mean, where things were going to go at the end of World War II. So Stalin essentially already had many of his plans in mind, realizing that he was going to be isolated, that the Soviet Union was going to be isolated, or definitely at odds with Western Europe and the United States, and that, it appears that he had kind of ideas to help set things in motion to secure what would be considered Soviet interests. Okay, but there's many things that need to be covered here that actually will help us understand more of how we even get to the war on terror in modern times, which we'll cover in the last chapter of this text. Something that I really feel is important to kind of consider and discuss. And also why we end up the United States as the world's last superpower, and that currently in 2015 the United States is still the disproportionately the most, well, I mean, I don't know if that's the word I'm looking for, but the amount of military power and the amount of bases around the world and the ability of the U.S. military to reach anywhere it wants to is unprecedented, and there's no real military competitor. Russia and China still hold a lot of weight. Russia is not anywhere close to the position of the United States, but every nation that does have a nuclear weapon does have that card on the table. And so the United States still can't invade Soviet Union without a potential of mutual destruction. And we're going to talk about mutually assured destruction and that kind of political theory that plays out in this from this time period, okay? And then the way the world gets carved up. Here in this picture, if you read the first part of chapter 28, this poor woman is caught up in the game of when, the Russians are on the east, and then there was West Germany, and people who were stuck on the Russian side who maybe didn't want to be there, okay, under the Russian occupation. I should also point out the German playwright, very famous playwright, Bertolt Brecht, who I posted, if you saw one of my announcements earlier, and I don't always post that announcement, but I should, Frank Sinatra singing Mac the Knife. And I mentioned that the guy who wrote the original song that made that popular in that tune was Bertolt Brecht, who's actually a communist, a German communist. I believe that a Doors song actually utilized using Bertolt Brecht. He's a very famously world-renowned, accepted playwright and a writer. He actually defected to he left as a German who spent some time being harassed by the anti-communist forces in America. He actually chose to go back to live in communist Russian-occupied Germany. And here's this woman was trying to leave. Some people actually did go in too. I just want to point that out. Okay, so obviously, just because a war is ended and there's officially people stop the fighting, it doesn't mean that what it means is that there's now countries that are completely decimated with their buildings all in rubbles, economies in shambles, and essentially everything's a mess. And obviously, as we saw with the Allied invasion of Russia at the end of World War I, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden wars are ending. It means the big theater, the big picture of this major global war is over. But we're going to see a lot of other things taking place on smaller scales that are within the kind of post World War II time. Okay, and you're going to have a lot of issues with Reconstruction, civil strifes and wars still taking place, and a refugee crisis. Okay, so that's something to just point out. Here's a map kind of showing all this, and I mean, you know, Germans that lived in places like Czechoslovakia, if you remember that, you know, Hitler was going to the aid in the name of going to the aid for German-speaking people living in Czechoslovakia. Well, after the war, you're going to have people, German speakers, getting expelled. You're going to have ethnic cleansing take place in many parts of the world after this. Where the bitter resentments that are left over from these wars are going to create a lot of massive demographic shifts through very violent means and organized means by the state. Okay, and I mean, we'll talk more about it later. You know, Israel ends up kicking out over 500,000 Palestinians to make way for the creating of the state of Israel. Later, when Pakistan is going to break away from independent India, you're going to have thousands of people in Pakistan being kicked out, Hindus and Sikhs and so forth, and you're going to see Muslims being expelled from India into Pakistan. We're going to see later wars between Greece and Turkey, in which all the Turks are kicked out of Greece and all the Greeks are kicked out of Turkey into Greece. I mean, this is really an unfortunate set of events that we're not going to be able to go into, but I just want to say that on many levels, like, we can go on and on and on and on. And then, by the way, the Arab countries are going to kick out Jews in response to the Jews kicking out the Arabs in Palestine. I mean, again, there's going to be a lot going on shortly after this war that is not peaceful or stable. Okay. Now, what's going to end up happening is we're going to get a shift or creation of the United Nations. We're going to have Yalta, the Yalta conference in particular I want to address. And basically Churchill and Stalin are going to, you know, they're going to try to carve up or make an idea of post-war Europe. And what happens from that time is that Stalin is supposed to make all these promises about democratic free elections in Eastern Europe, you know, as long as they're pro-Soviet. That all these things there's just a lot of muddled things that ultimately I think we can just argue is that it's going to lead to what we're going to see, which is that the Soviet Union is going to stay, and they're going to then take back any kind of promises that they've made, knowing that the West isn't going to have their back, and they're going to occupy countries for the interests of securing a war-torn, a really war-devastated Soviet Union. And they're going to make those other states buffer zones and utilize their resources to help rebuild themselves, as the competition then goes between the capitalist democratic countries and now really the Soviet Union. Okay, that's mainly what I want to say about this part. I want you to read the text, okay, here. And so what I want to do is, you know, this is kind of a little bit of a backdrop to what we were covering, ending the war. I'm going to put on those documentary clips from my World Civ class. Some things we'll go over again, like I'll kind of like repeat some things. Also, there's a little bit of contradiction in some of the things that I've said to you here from there. One, in my lecture, I kind of, in my World Civ lecture, I kind of assert more of the idea that the dropping of the nuclear bomb was absolutely a message sent to Stalin for the most part. In my last lecture that I gave you for Western Civ, I just said that that's on the table. Every once in a while, you'll see a lot of historians do this. Sometimes when you have debatable topics, you watch something or you read something that convinces you a little bit more strongly at one point, and then you kind of later on, maybe you hold back or revise yourself. History is always about revision and rethinking presupposed ideas, okay? And so I kind of want to point that out to you. I also want to point out that sometimes the figures that are in almost all textbooks about how many people die in given wars is going to look a little different in each textbook, because that's always being revised as well. Usually they're not far off from each other. I mean, usually it's not like they're not going to say, there's 100,000 or 1,000 dead at a given time, but sometimes it can get that way. I mean, for instance, right now there's not a unified global discussion to really count how many civilians have died in Iraq as a direct result of the war. There's a website called bodycount.com, but that's kind of it. And so, just like with the Battle of Stalingrad, it wasn't like really 100% clear, information on how many civilian deaths have occurred. And with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people can debate about what constitutes directly being linked to the death of the bombs, and those numbers are going to be revised. And I'm just kind of pointing that out. There's a little bit of contradiction in some of the numbers and some of the things that I said in some of my other videos. Not extremely, but just enough to kind of give you, an idea of where I can go back and forth, kind of even myself on my lectures, where I'm asserting something a little bit stronger maybe, and the other time kind of revising that. And I hope that you see that instead of that undermining the idea of history, to remind ourselves why, as historians, we don't necessarily like the overall push for multiple choice tests in history, because that's not really how history works. We're constantly seeing new information, and there's a lot of gray areas, and things can happen to alter that. I hope you didn't find that tangent too pointless, and kind of realize, because it's especially relevant to this time period. Because for the Cold War, being at odds, you're not going to get neutral history about anything in this time period, from the Soviet side to the Western Europe. I mean, try to find a neutral book about Mao or Fidel Castro or Stalin. It's not going to happen. You're rather pro-communist or anti. And then when the Soviet Union falls, later, which we're going to get into, their archives open up. And still to this day, they're constantly revising things. Israel's arguments that they made for the war with the Arabs, in the 80s, they're going to have their files open up. And all these new historians looked it over and they said, oh my goodness, a lot of the things that the Arabs said were right. And we were actually more at fault for a lot of the stuff in the war than we've claimed. But the Arab states have their secret files in relations to the war, and they've not opened those up. So if those ever got opened up, then we would have to relook over the original war between the Arabs and the Jews that creates the state of Israel all over again as well. So this is how history works. We're constantly revising through new information. Okay, enough of that. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to move on by getting us into the content of this chapter.